In May this year, the Johannesburg High Court granted a historic ruling in a class action lawsuit that gave hope to thousands of women. 69 applicants who had contracted silicosis and tuberculosis as a result of their exposure to silica dust sought to hold South Africa's gold mining industry accountable on behalf of all miners and the families of all miners who have had to take care of those affected by the illness. The non-profit organization Sonke Gender Justice and the Treatment Action Campaign submitted evidence specifically on the gender defect of the mining-related lung diseases, including the unpaid caregiving provided by women and children and the ripple effects of having to dedicate time, money, and personal well-being to provide this care. The court found in favor of the organizations and sought to remedy the strong gender effects that migrant labor health consequences had on these families. Now, to discuss the ruling as well as the overall importance of this ruling, I'm joined by Policy Development and Advocacy Fellow at Sonke Gender Justice, Thabang Pooe. Thabang, pleasure to have you with us, man.
Only my pleasure to be here.
And this has been a long-running case, right? It was even taken to the United States, and many of the miners who are now living with the effects of silicosis wanting compensation for that. Now the courts have ruled that the miners must be compensated. But you go one step further. You want those who give them care to also be compensated. And it looks like there are a few women who have been granted such compensation. Tell me more about the outcomes of this ruling.
So just to give a bit of context and background, so what has happened is that a class action lawsuit has been brought. And so in South Africa, if you seek to bring a class action, the first thing you need to do is bring a certification case before the courts so that certify the class action to continue forward. So at this stage of the litigation, it was just the certification of a class.
Explain what certification is.
So in class action litigation, you are saying that as a group of people or a person, I represent a class of people.
Okay.
And so I want to bring litigation on all their behalf.
Yes.
So because you represent a number of people who at that stage may not be involved in the litigation, there are a couple of things you need to show the court. The first is that you have an interest, a substantial interest in the case, that you represent a definable group of people, and that you have a cause of action which a court can face. And then more importantly, the court will also look at whether you have adequate representation, which is not trying to take advantage. And class actions, especially in other countries such as America, have been used as, you know, a platform for lawyers to make a lot of money suing multinational corporations. And so in order to avoid that, in South Africa, there's a certification process which seeks to ensure that class actions are used as a vehicle for accessing justice and not as an exploitation tool. And so for you to bring a class action, the first thing you do is you certify the class.
Right.
And so this first leg of the case was for the 69 people representing over 500,000 miners in sub-Saharan Africa to bring the certification case, and the South Gauteng High Court agreed that the certification should indeed go forward. What Sonke Gender Justice and the Treatment Action Campaign are doing is saying that, yes, there is an effect on people who worked at the mines, but when somebody contracts silicosis, which is a latent disease and is deadly, there's no treatment. So you basically go home to die. That there are people who are giving care to miners who should also be considered in terms of compensation, because women have to leave their jobs. Sometimes children have to leave school in order to take care of their sick fathers, brothers, uncles. And so they too need to be considered when we're looking at compensation for diseases such as silicosis.
Now, has the compensation been quantified yet, or is this matter before the courts to measure how much money should be given not only to the miners who've contracted the disease, but also to the caregivers at home?
So there hasn't been a quantification yet of the damages that is to be paid, and that's because we are still at the beginning stages of the litigation. So because after the certification, it's then that you go through the trial process where you then start to determine liability, who's liable, and how much they are liable for. But this process hasn't started because the mining companies have appealed the certification judgment. They are saying that this class of people should never have been certified, and that there are different mechanisms through which minors or former mine workers can seek compensation. And so the case is now going forward to the Supreme Court of Appeal next year to review the certification judgment granted by the High Court.
And I can imagine the courts somewhere, or the counter-argument is that if you compensate the minor, why should you compensate the caregiver? Or in one compensation, you must include the costs of somebody who's providing home care anyway. But let me look at it from the point of view of your organization, Sonke Gender Justice Organization. Why are you seeking this relief from the courts?
We're seeking relief because ideally, in an ideal situation, if somebody, diminishes your life in a particular way, you would want them to pay for restitution to ensure that your diminishment is then catered for. In the circumstances of mine workers, once their lives are diminished in this capacity, nobody's paying for their caregiving. And this caregiving is given by women who sacrifice so much, including
and I
employment.
I want you to illustrate the point, because we're sitting in the studio talking about it. I can imagine a lot of viewers who've got nothing to do with mining or may not have an appreciation for the devastating effects of silicosis. We may not appreciate the amount of sacrifice that people must make to look after such a person.
Yes. What we've done as an organization is we've gone to mine-sending communities and gone and interviewed widows and wives of people who have contracted silicosis. And I'll just give you one example of Nomazizi. She lives in rural Eastern Cape in Dudra. And when we went to see her last week, we just asked her, what do you do on a day-to-day, particularly, let's say, a bad day? She has to wake up at 4 a.m., boil water so that he can steam his face, so that his lungs can open up. So what silicosis does, it starts eating away at your lung tissue to a point that you don't have any lungs and are unable to breathe. So at night, you get night sweats, you're unable to breathe, wheezing, and so once that happens and your lungs close up, there has to be a way in which you open them up. So she describes having to boil water so that he can open up his chest, and then make some porridge so he can take some of his medication. Remember that because it doesn't have a cure, the treatment that you take is a lot of pills, and you have to eat. And many of these women are living in conditions of poverty. There's unemployment, and all that mine workers get is a disability grant of 1,500. And so she describes having to make porridge, then after goes back to sleep, wakes up again at 7, pours water and bathes him. On bad days, he can't walk because any single thing that a person has to do, they have to breathe in and out, they have to get some oxygen so that the blood can flow, so that your body can function. And if they're unable to do that, it means they have to sit in the bed, they relieve themselves there. So she has to do that. Thereafter, she will then have to do her household chores. If they are young children, tend to their needs, take them to school, then come back, make sure he eats, takes more of his medication, does other chores, cleaning, washing, and then goes back to tend more if there needs to be relief, clean up, and all of that. And that is very taxing, particularly on women who their whole lives have been relying on these men to provide for them. And now they have to make a plan, not only in terms of taking care of them while they're ailing, but where's the next meal going to come from?
And of course, if the person spending the whole time at home looking after a sick person, that person cannot even go out and look for employment, which is non-existent anyway in the first place. But
exactly.
How long is the case going to take before it reaches finality?
We have no idea. I think what's also important to note is we are fighting mining houses who have millions of rands to spend on litigation. If you look at the High Court proceedings, the courtroom was filled with just lawyers. And so that's the financial muscle that mining companies bring. And they have the power and the potential to prolong the litigation as long as possible. Right now, we're looking at going to the SCA mid-2017. And if we are unsuccessful or they are unsuccessful, there'll probably be an appeal to the Constitutional Court, which will take yet another year. Thereafter, if we are successful, then we go back to trial and then start the process of determining liability and cost and all of that. So we're looking at a number of years. even though this case has started, 5, 10, 15 years
yes.
ago, because it's very hard to hold big conglomerates to account where there's a lot of financial power.
It's been a long struggle and a long road for yourselves, but it's people like you and your organization that are helping many communities in outlying areas who otherwise would not have made it to the courts. So we appreciate your work, and we hope that this matter is finalized as soon as possible, which might be 2, 3 years. We don't know, but everything of the best to you, Thabang. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
That's Thabang Pooe of the Sonke Gender Justice organization talking to us about the case that has been brought before the courts, particularly by those who are providing home care to the miners who are living with the silicosis, the devastating effects of gold mining. And this is something that may have affected over 500,000 on the African continent. So we wait to see how this matter is resolved finally.